From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The officer took a great man, a great father, a great brother. He loved his daughter. Gianna meant the world to him. And we would never get that back.
Black Lives Matter protesters take to the streets of Minneapolis and other cities for the start of the murder trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin for killing George Floyd. We'll go to Minneapolis for the latest. Then to Texas, where Republican Governor Greg Abbott's defying public health experts by ordering Texas to fully reopen and lifting a statewide mask mandate.
All businesses of any type are allowed to open 100%.
We'll speak to a Texas doctor who's recovering from COVID. She's a long hauler. Then we'll look back at one of the most stunning acts of defiance of the Vietnam War era.
Let's break into an FBI office, get their files, and get what they're doing in their own handwriting.
50 years ago this week, 8 activists, including a cab driver, a daycare director, and 2 professors, broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole every document they found. The break-in exposed COINTELPRO, the FBI's secret counterintelligence program, which had targeted civil rights, Black Power, and anti-war groups. We'll speak to one of the burglars, Bonnie Raines, and Paul Coates, the pioneering Black publisher and bookseller in Baltimore, who was targeted by COINTELPRO. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said Monday fully vaccinated people can safely gather together in small groups without masks as long as everyone involved is at low risk for severe COVID-19. This is CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky.
With more and more people getting vaccinated each day, we are starting to turn a corner. And as more Americans are vaccinated, a growing body of evidence now tells us that there are some activities that fully vaccinated people can resume at low risk to themselves.
The CDC is still advising against long-distance travel, even for fully vaccinated people. It's not yet known how likely it is for vaccinated people to spread coronavirus, perhaps as asymptomatic carriers. The new recommendation came as the number of U.S. residents who've received at least one dose of a vaccine reached 60 million. Over 700 new COVID-19 deaths were reported across the U.S. Monday, pushing the U.S. death toll over the past year to more than 525,000. Tomorrow, Texas is set to end its statewide mask mandate. We'll speak to a long hauler, a doctor recovering from COVID, later in the broadcast. Italy's passed 100,000 confirmed COVID-19 deaths, the second European country after the UK to reach that toll. In Peru, a 104-year-old woman on Monday became that nation's first elderly person vaccinated against COVID. Peru's recorded nearly 50,000 deaths from the disease, though the true numbers likely significantly higher. Vietnam also rolled out its vaccination campaign Monday. Vietnam has recorded just 2,500 cases and 35 deaths from COVID-19 after running one of the world's most successful public health campaigns of the pandemic. Meanwhile, Cuba's begun late-stage trials of its Soberana 2 vaccine, with 44,000 volunteers receiving shots this week. It's the first vaccine candidate produced in Latin America to make it to Phase 2 trial. In Minnesota, jury selection in the murder trial of the former Minneapolis white police officer who killed George Floyd was called off Monday after an appeals court ordered the trial judge consider reinstating a third-degree murder charge against him. The judge plans to move forward with jury selection today unless ordered by the appeals court to halt the process. Derek Chauvin faces second-degree murder and manslaughter charges for killing George Floyd, African-American father, by kneeling on his neck for more than 9 minutes on May 25, 2020. Meanwhile, Chauvin is also facing possible federal charges. The New York Times recently revealed a federal grand jury in Minneapolis has been hearing from witnesses. After headlines will go to Minneapolis for the latest on the Derek Chauvin murder trial. In Kentucky, a judge has permanently dismissed all charges against Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, for allegedly shooting and wounding a police officer serving a no-knock warrant in Breonna Taylor's home last March. Walker has said the officers never identified themselves before entering the home and never attempted to save Taylor as she lay dying after she was struck by a hail of police gunfire. Last September, a grand jury failed to charge any of the 3 white Louisville police officers involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor with her death. In immigration news, a record 3,200 children are being detained at U.S. Border Patrol facilities that resemble jail cells, with nearly half of them held for longer than the legal limit of 3 days. This comes as immigrant justice advocates are denouncing the Biden administration's ongoing detention of unaccompanied children who are being held at government facilities, separated from their families for weeks on end. The children usually arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border with a family member but are separated from them until federal officials confirm they are relatives. Meanwhile, the Biden administration's granted temporary protected status to thousands of Venezuelans living in the U.S. The relief is expected to impact over 300,000 people. The federal government also plans to review its sanctions on Venezuela. An economic and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, greatly exacerbated by sanctions imposed by the U.S. government, has forced over 5 million people to flee in recent years. Last month, a report published by a UN special rapporteur said the sanctions, quote, constitute violations of international law and inflict, quote, a devastating effect on the broad scope of human rights, especially the right to food, right to health, right to life, right to education, and right to development. In Brazil, a judge has annulled all convictions against former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. In 2018, Lula was sentenced to 12 years in prison over a disputed corruption and money laundering conviction handed down by the conservative judge Sergio Moro, a former ally of the far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. Moro allegedly colluded with prosecutors to seek Lula's conviction. Lula has long maintained his innocence and has vowed to challenge Bolsonaro in the 2022 elections. At the time of his imprisonment, Lula was leading the presidential polls. To see our interview with Lula, go to democracynow.org. New York Attorney General Letitia James has named 2 attorneys to lead an inquiry into sexual harassment allegations against New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. They're former federal prosecutor June Kim and Ann Clark, an employment discrimination attorney. Cuomo has resisted calls he stepped down, including from prominent New York Democrats, after at least 4 women accused him of inappropriate verbal and physical conduct. Meanwhile, the Crown Publishing Group told the New York Times Monday it'll stop promoting and printing Governor Cuomo's book about New York's coronavirus outbreak. Sales of American Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic were already plummeting following reports Cuomo's aides pressured state health officials to cover up the true number of COVID-19 deaths in New York's nursing homes. Missouri's long-serving Republican Senator Roy Blunt said Monday he'll not run for re-election in 2022 when his term expires. He's the 5th incumbent Republican senator to announce plans not to run again, with 2 others, Wisconsin's Ron Johnson and Iowa's 87-year-old Chuck Grassley, still undeclared. Georgia's state Senate has approved legislation that would end the right to voters to cast absentee ballots without excuses while toughening voter ID requirements. It's one of more than 250 voter suppression laws being pushed by Republicans in state legislatures around the U.S. in the wake of the 2020 election. On Monday, Iowa's Republican Governor Kim Reynolds signed a voter suppression bill that limits Iowa's early voting period and closes polls 1 hour earlier on Election Day. Elsewhere in Iowa, a trial got underway Monday for a Des Moines Register reporter who was arrested last year while covering a Black Lives Matter protest. Andrea Sahuri streamed this video from the back of a police wagon May 31st, 2020, shortly after she was arrested while covering clashes between police and protesters in Des Moines.
I was saying, I'm pressed. Police deliberately took me, sprayed pepper spray on my face, and then put me in zip ties. What are they called? Zip ties. I'm just doing my job as a journalist.
A police officer who testified at Sahuri's trial said he did not realize she was a reporter. Meanwhile, prosecutors have said Zahouri's status as a journalist is irrelevant to her charges and arrest. Amnesty International responded in a statement, quote, "Treating media work as a crime is a human rights violation." South Dakota's Republican Governor Kristi Noem said Monday she's excited to sign a bill barring transgender women and girls from competing in high school and college sports. Mississippi Republican Governor Tate Reeves has promised to sign similar legislation in Mississippi. South Dakota's ACLU chapter responded, quote, "The danger this legislation creates is real. The potential harm to South Dakota is significant, and the stakes for transgender students are high. Kids are hurting," they said. And massive women-led marches were held around the world Monday to commemorate International Women's Day. In Mexico, thousands of women from across the country gathered in Mexico City's Zócalo protesting skyrocketing femicides. They're also blasting President Andrés Manuel López Obrador for supporting a gubernatorial candidate for the state of Guerrero who's accused of rape. Protesters were met by police who used tear gas and batons to try to disperse the crowd. This is one of the protesters.
My name is Mercedes Yamilet Hernandez. I am proud to be a Mexican woman. I come here for all the women they have taken away from us, for every girl they have killed. I was raped from age 4 to age 9, and my family just defended my attacker. The state also defended him. Today I also come for my friend who has disappeared. I am proud to be here to just scream. This has to end. They have to stop killing us, raping us, and assaulting us. And they just keep doing it. The pandemic has not stopped them from acting this way. They just don't care.
In Guatemala, hundreds of women and girls led marches and ceremonies in different parts of Guatemala demanding justice for victims of femicides and survivors of violence. Women also marked the 4th-year anniversary of the death of 41 girls who were burnt alive at an orphanage near Guatemala City after they protested sexual and physical violence at the facility. Massive marches also took place in La Paz, Bolivia, and Istanbul, Turkey, where thousands took to the streets, including Uyghur women and girls who led a demonstration protesting China's treatment of Uyghurs. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, Black Lives Matter protesters marched in Minneapolis and other cities Monday to mark what was supposed to be the start of the murder trial of Derek Chauvin. The former Minneapolis police officer is charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter for killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for more than 9 minutes. The killing of Floyd on May 25, 2020, sparked protests around the world. Jury selection was scheduled to begin Monday, but was delayed after an appeals court ordered the trial judge to consider reinstating a third-degree murder charge against the white police officer. Meanwhile, Chauvin is also facing possible additional federal charges. The New York Times recently revealed a federal grand jury in Minneapolis has been hearing from witnesses. Relatives of George Floyd, including his sister Bridget, spoke outside the Minneapolis courthouse Monday.
The officer took a great man, a great father, a great brother, a great uncle, and a great father. He really took a great father. He was so family-oriented. He loved his family. He loved his daughter. Gianna meant the world to him. And we would never get that back.
Over the weekend, George Floyd's brother, Philonis Floyd, spoke at a news conference ahead of the trial in Houston.
My brother said, I can't breathe multiple times, but the officer sat on his neck with a smirk on his face. My brother screamed, tell my kids I love them, as his soul left his body. He told me time and time, my name will ring bells all around the world. I never thought it would be just like this. I thought he would be somebody on a TV show or in a basketball game. I had no idea that I would have to watch my brother being buried. in front of millions of people. It was devastating.
Joining us from Minneapolis is Nekima Levy-Armstrong, civil rights attorney, activist, founder of the Racial Justice Network, executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation, former president of the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP. Nekima, welcome back to Democracy Now! I know you've been in the streets, and you're an attorney. Could you start off by talking about why the trial was delayed?
The trial was delayed because the Attorney General's office sought to reinstate the third-degree murder charge against Derek Chauvin. And the defense attorneys filed an appeal to the Court of Appeals decision that said that prosecutors could, in fact, add that charge back in the complaint against Derek Chauvin. Defense attorneys are pushing for that change to occur in the opposite direction. And so now the judge is waiting to hear what the appeals court is going to say.
And could you talk about, Nekima, about the jury selection process, concerns that may exist in the community about the previous makeup of juries in Hennepin County?
Yes. A big part of the concern is whether or not there will be any real diversity on the jury. Of course, we have complicating factors such as COVID-19 in terms of the impacts upon the Black community and other communities of color, which may make it difficult for people to feel comfortable serving on a jury, especially for as long as the trial might be. Beyond that, the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 have significantly impacted the Black community. Additionally, the jury questionnaire had questions such as how the potential jurors may feel about Black Lives Matter, the defund the police movement, the Blue Lives Matter movement. All of those things are going to play a role in terms of who is ultimately selected for the jury.
And do you have any concerns about the possibility of the defense attorney seeking to move the case somewhere else in Minnesota?
I absolutely have concerns about that. I grew up in Los Angeles in the era of the Rodney King beating, and I recall the impacts of the case being moved out of LA County to Simi Valley, which was the home of a lot of retired police officers, as well as mostly middle-income white people. And of course, they acquitted those officers who beat Rodney King. So our concern is that something similar will happen in this case if the venue is moved. Hennepin County is one of the most diverse counties in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota is 84% white. And so if they move the case outside of Hennepin County, it is even less likely that there will be a diverse jury, and it is also less likely that there will be people who are empathetic to what George Floyd experienced at the hands of Derek Chauvin and the other three officers who killed him.
Nekima Levy-Armstrong, I wanted to get back to that issue of why they're trying to add a lesser charge to the second-degree murder, the significance of this third-degree murder charge. You have the conviction of a previous Minneapolis police officer, Mohammed Noor, marking the first guilty verdict for a fatal shooting by an on-duty cop in Minnesota in decades in 2018. In 2019. Can you talk about how that affects this trial and what could be the strategy of the prosecutors right now?
Absolutely. So as you all alluded to earlier, there is somewhat of a delay because of prosecutors seeking to reinstate that third-degree murder charge against Derek Chauvin. Now, under Minnesota law, a third-degree murder charge typically applies if a person engages in imminently dangerous conduct without regard for the life of others. Now, typically, a third-degree murder charge would apply in a circumstance in which someone just opened fire in a random place like a movie theater or at a gas station, and they were not intending to target a specific individual. However, in the case of Mohammed Noor, the former Minneapolis police officer who killed Justine Rusacek Damon, he was charged with third-degree murder. He was convicted. He is serving over 12 years in prison. And a big part of that case had to do with the fact that Mohammed Noor reached over his partner, shot out the window, and shot Justine Rusacek Damon without even assessing the scene and, figuring out, was it a child? Was it a woman? Was it a threat? He just fired and she was killed. And so the court thus far has upheld that third-degree murder conviction against Mohammed Noor. And as a result of that, prosecutors in the Derek Chauvin case are making the decision that if for some reason they cannot get a conviction for second-degree murder or second-degree manslaughter, then third-degree murder charges give the jury another option. Other aspect of
let me ask you
murder,
something that we hadn't really reported on before. The New York Times reporting recently that Derek Chauvin agreed to plead guilty last spring to third-degree murder and served 10 years in prison, but Attorney General William Barr rejected the plea deal.
Yes, and for those of us who live in Minnesota, we were not aware that a plea deal was even offered to Derek Chauvin until that New York Times report happened. Apparently, the Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman made that deal with Derek Chauvin to try to quiet things down in the Twin Cities and get the case over with. But of course, we've had many concerns with Mike Freeman's decision-making and the fact that he has routinely let killer cops off the hook in Hennepin County.
And could you talk about the city's preparation for the trial, the fortification of downtown Minneapolis, and how the community is responding to efforts to limit protests and demonstrations during the trial?
Yes, we have had concerns about the city, the county, our governor, as well as our Department of Public Safety with regard to their excessive focus on security measures outside of the Hennepin County Government Center. They have placed chain link fencing, barricades, and barbed wire all around the government center. And there's only a small area in which protesters are actually able to gather. Of course, this raises a number of concerns about our local government, our state government infringing upon our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and peaceable assembly. We have publicly laid out those concerns, yet in the midst of the excessive focus on security, we have still continued to protest. We took to the streets on Sunday. We took to the streets yesterday. I anticipate many more additional protests. One other aspect of security has to do with a joint task force, a joint coalition of many police departments that are coming together. And the head of public safety, John Harrington, spoke about hundreds of officers from surrounding suburban police departments being recruited to be a part of that security force, that large police force, in the event of civil unrest during the pendency of this trial.
And are you concerned about provocateurs, Nikema? Police had issued, like a year ago, an arrest warrant for the man known as Umbrella Man, who was filmed smashing windows of an auto parts dealership a few days after the police killing of Floyd. Investigators saying the man is a white supremacist who sought to provoke violence against protesters. Also, the first setting of the fire of the police station, also believed to be a white supremacist.
We are absolutely concerned about provocateurs. I mean, to this day, we haven't seen Umbrella Man taken into custody. And so if there's evidence that he was engaging in the kind of activity that people caught him doing, breaking glass, being caught on camera doing so, very suspicious, why isn't he in custody? We also are concerned about what other steps law enforcement may or may not be taking to track down provocateurs ahead of time. The overwhelming majority of our protests have been peaceful, and this has been for over the last 6 years since we have been taking to the streets demanding an end to police violence in the state of Minnesota.
Well, Nekima, we thank you for spending this time with us. I'm sure we're coming back to you soon. We will see how long this trial goes and what happens. Nekima Levy-Armstrong, civil rights attorney, activist, founder of the Racial Justice Network, executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation, former president of the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP. Next up, we go to Texas, where the Republican governor is defying public health experts by ordering Texas to fully reopen at 100% and lifting a statewide mask mandate. Stay with us. Go Up Moses by Roberta Flack. To get our daily digest, you can go to democracynow.org and sign up for the latest news stories and alerts. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention said Monday, fully vaccinated people can safely gather together in small groups without masks as long as everyone involved is at low risk for severe COVID-19. The new recommendation comes as Texas is set to fully lift its COVID lockdown restrictions tomorrow for everyone, not just those who are vaccinated, making it the largest state to do so. At least 35 states have kept their mask-wearing rules in place with various levels of enforcement, but Texas joins Mississippi, Louisiana, and Michigan in announcing plans to lift restrictions. Meanwhile, Montana, Iowa, North Dakota, and Mississippi have already lifted their mask-wearing mandates. Michigan's eased other lockdown rules. Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina never enforced mask mandates. It was on the same day last week that CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky said, now is not the time to loosen restrictions because of an increase in COVID cases and deaths when Texas Governor Greg Abbott defied public health experts and issued his executive order to end all COVID-19 restrictions starting March 10th. He tweeted, quote, Texas is open 100%, drawing scorn from President Biden, who accused him of, quote, Neanderthal thinking. Abbott fought back by accusing the Biden administration of releasing COVID-positive illegal immigrants in our state. This comes as CBS News reports over 3,200 unaccompanied children were detained at Border Patrol facilities along the Texas-Mexico border Monday alone, and nearly half were held for longer than the legal limit of 3 days. Throughout Texas, cities and businesses have vowed to continue their mask mandates. For more, we go to Houston, where we're joined by Dr. Donna Murphy, a physician, scientist, community organizer, co-founder of Doctors in Politics PAC. Dr. Murphy is a survivor of COVID-19 who for months experienced ongoing symptoms, a condition being described as long COVID or long hauler. She's helping to lead a campaign to demand Texas reinstate the mask mandate. Doctor, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you respond to what Governor Abbott has done, lifting the mask mandate and opening Texas 100% for business?
Sure. I think it's really important here to not be distracted by the fact that this is completely politically motivated. He made this pronouncement on what is Texas Independence Day, and it is a maneuver to conceal failures to modernize our electric grid in Texas. In the weeks prior to this executive order, we had dozens of deaths across the state from hypothermia, from carbon monoxide poisoning, from fires, with untold economic impacts. He also is, pandering to this misguided conflation of the mask mandate with infringements of personal freedom. And then within days, as you alluded to, he rejected an offer for federal aid on COVID-19 testing of asylum seekers, blaming them for infections in South Texas. And this is despite the fact that the test positivity among those migrants was actually lower than the population at large in Cameron County, which is the county of entry. So I think it's really important that we not, get consumed by the affront to scientific knowledge and our understanding of this virus and how this virus is transmitted. That is not what this is about.
And Dr. Murphy, could you talk about this continuing rift between the major cities of Texas, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, El Paso, and the state leaders on the issue of how best to deal with the pandemic?
Yeah, that has been super frustrating to witness because, the political party of our good governor is one that is ostensibly ideologically committed to local control. And despite this, throughout the pandemic, repeatedly, the governor has tried to remove local authority in determining what to do with managing the pandemic. So a lot of our cities, which are democratically held cities, the leadership in those cities have often tried to do what is more consistent with what has been advised by the CDC, for instance, and the governor has tried to pull back throughout.
And can you tell us a little more, Dr. Murphy, on this issue of the border? You have him attacking immigrants, saying they're bringing in COVID, yet at the same time he rejected money from the federal government to test immigrants who were coming in.
That's right. And it's actually the case that they have been testing by the tens of thousands. I've actually been very involved with work at the border throughout the migrant protection protocols in Matamoros and also in Brownsville remotely because I run a program in Matamoros. So I've been very plugged in, actually, to the medical care that's been provided and also all of the efforts that have been made by non-governmental organizations as well as local government there to attempt to mitigate the impact of COVID among that population. So again, this is, as I said, a very politically motivated maneuver.
I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about your own personal experience with contracting COVID-19, and if you could talk somewhat about the vaccine rollouts in Houston that you're aware of, because there have been recent reports in the last day or two that there's a disproportionate exhibiting of side effects among women who received the vaccine compared to men. I'm wondering if you might have some thoughts on that as well.
Sure. So my personal experience with COVID, I was actually ironically involved in COVID education and organizing and advocacy about a month before I myself got sick with COVID, unfortunately, and then became a COVID long hauler, where I was grappling with pretty moderate symptoms at some point that were cognitive and psychiatric. So this was not trivial at all. That being said, I also was not as disabled as some of my colleagues and others in patient-led research and advocacy communities. So I felt privileged that I was not so disabled. But it was still very trying. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the long-term implications of COVID. So it's been a very difficult path for me. I mean, most recently this past week, I had significant symptoms that kept me from being able to write like original material. And I do a lot of writing for my work and the advocacy that I do. So that's been a source of frustration. As far as the rollout in Texas, we have less than 20% of Texans who have been fully vaccinated. Some counties are grappling with such low rates of vaccination that they've actually opened up vaccinations to the general public without any restrictions. So that tells you something. A lot of those counties actually are in East Texas, so not too far from me in the greater Houston area. Yeah, so it has been very problematic. As to the disproportionate impact on women, I want to be very careful here because it's hard to know until you have some distance to see what the side effects are and whether they actually reflect realities, right? Underlying realities. And what I don't want to do is to dissuade anyone from getting the vaccination. I've kept up with a lot of the side effect profiles for Pfizer, Moderna, and now Johnson & Johnson has recently been released. So we'll see what that looks like. But in general, the side effects are mild to moderate. And I will tell you that if the alternative is death and permanent disability, which is a very real possibility for up to 30% of the population exhibiting long hauler symptoms, that is a risk worth taking.
Have you been vaccinated? And for people who've had COVID, do you get 1 or 2 shots when it's a 2-shot deal? Of course, Johnson & Johnson is just 1 shot.
Yeah, I have not yet been vaccinated because I felt that there has been a little bit of pushback on physicians who do not see patients in person, which I do not. I read EEGs or brainwave tests for patients from the comfort of my own home. And for as long as we don't have people having adequate access to the vaccines, I felt a little bit uncomfortable putting myself forward as somebody who needs to get vaccinated as, quote, a frontline worker. So I've been waiting, honestly, until it's opened up to the general population. I have thought actually to drive over to East Texas where they have opened it up, where I don't think that I would be taking someone's place. But yeah, I'm sorry. The second question, I don't remember now.
1 or 2 shots.
1 or 2 shots. Yeah. So for COVID long haulers, a lot of people are saying, and in some countries globally, they are suggesting that COVID long haulers just get 1 shot. I don't know that there is a lot of evidence about that yet. I was planning on getting the 2 shots if I got Pfizer or Moderna, and then the one, of course, with Johnson & Johnson.
I want to ask you about this Mexican restaurant in Houston that said it's going to keep its mask rule in place. So people threatened to call ICE on the staff in retaliation. Can you talk about what happened there? It's called Picos, and talk about this rising anger and violence in Texas over pandemic restrictions and how Abbott has fueled this, both the anti-science, racist, xenophobic misinformation around the pandemic. Yeah,
I mean, again, I think he is deliberately trying to direct our attention to, a narrative that is consistent with his political thinking, which is that the cause of these problems is something that can be placed on others, right? Not us, but on others. And I think that's part of what happened here is that people, unfortunately, are following his modeling. And that's why this occurred, right? That Houston is a very diverse and in many ways a very inclusive place. I know Picos, actually. I used to go there before they moved to their current location, and that somebody was saying that they were going to call ICE on the folks there is a reflection of the impact that Abbott has had on the narrative of who is responsible for the transmission of COVID. And in many ways, I feel like he is directly responsible. And then certainly people who are following his example are responsible as well.
Dr. Donna Murphy, we want to thank you for being with us. Physician, scientist, community organizer, co-founder of the Doctors in Politics PAC, and a long-haul survivor of COVID-19. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. It's the 50th anniversary of one of the more audacious events that happened in protest and resistance around the Vietnam War. And it happened in Pennsylvania, in Media, Pennsylvania. It was March 8th, 1971. 8 activists broke into an FBI office. Stay tuned to hear what happened.
I've got
Tony Basil here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. 50 years ago this week, a group of activists staged one of the most stunning acts of defiance of the Vietnam War era. On March 8, 1971, 8 activists, including a cab driver, a daycare director, 2 professors, broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole every document they found. They wanted to document how FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was spying on citizens and actively suppressing dissent. The break-in occurred as much of the nation was fixated on a boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, which was billed as the fight of the century. The identity of the burglars would remain a mystery for over 40 years. Soon after stealing the documents, the activists, calling themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI, began leaking shocking details about FBI abuses to the media. The documents exposed COINTELPRO, the FBI's secret counterintelligence program, a global, clandestine, unconstitutional practice of surveillance, infiltration, and disruption of groups engaged in protest, dissent, and social change. Targets included the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, the Young Lords, anti-war groups, black booksellers, and other groups. The leaked documents triggered congressional investigations, increased oversight, and the eventual passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The FBI never knew who was involved in the break-in until 2014, when several of the burglars made their identity public to coincide with the publication of The Burglary, a book by former Washington Post reporter Betty Metzger, who'd reported on the leaked documents back in '71. In 2014, Betty Metzger appeared on Democracy Now!
One of the things that I remember most from those files was the truly blanket surveillance of African-American people that was described. It was in Philadelphia, but it also prescribed national programs. It was quite stunning. First, it described the surveillance. It took place in every place where people would gather, churches, classrooms, stores down the street, just everything. But it also specifically prescribed that every FBI agent was supposed to have an informer just for the purpose of coming back every 2 weeks and talking to them about what they had observed about black Americans. And in Washington, D.C. at the time, that was 6 informers for every FBI agent informing on black Americans. The surveillance was so enormous that it led various people, rather sedate people in editorial offices and in Congress, to compare it to the Stasi, the dreaded secret police of East Germany.
3 of the burglars also appeared on Democracy Now! Back in 2014 in one of their first joint interviews. Keith Forsyth served as designated lockpicker during the break-in. He hoped the break-in would speed the end of the Vietnam War.
War was escalating and not de-escalating. And I think what really pushed me over the edge was shortly after the invasion of Cambodia, there were 4 students killed at Kent State and 2 more killed at Jackson State. And I'm sorry, I think I'd have this down after all these years. And that really pushed me over the edge, that it was time to do more than just protest, than just march with a sign.
John Raines was another one of the burglars. At the time of the break-in, he was a professor of religion at Temple University.
The problem was J. Edgar Hoover was untouchable. He was a national icon. I mean, he had presidents who were afraid of him. The people that we had elected to oversee J. Edgar Hoover's FBI were either enamored of him or terrified of him. Nobody was holding him accountable. And that meant that somebody had to get objective evidence of what his FBI was doing. And that led us to the idea that Bill Avedon suggested to us. Let's break into an FBI office, get their files, and get what they're doing in their own handwriting.
That was John Raines speaking on Democracy Now! In 2014. He died in 2017. Raines' wife, Bonnie Raines, also helped break into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania 50 years ago. At the time of the break-in, John and Bonnie had 3 young children. She's joining us now from her home in Philadelphia. We are also joined by Paul Coates, the founder and director of Black Classic Press and BCP Digital Printing. He's a former member and defense captain of the Black Panther Party in Baltimore. As a black bookseller, he was targeted by the FBI as part of its COINTELPRO, its counterintelligence program. And yes, he is also the father of the acclaimed writer Ta-Nehisi Coates. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Bonnie, you were the one who cased the joint. Is that right? Who went to these Media FBI offices, that's Media, Pennsylvania, beforehand to get a sense of the blueprints of the 2 rooms, whatever it was.
That's right. I mean, we had cased the exterior environment, so we knew what the police patrols were, but we had to get inside the offices to see whether there were alarm systems and to see what the layout of the offices were, where the doors were that we hoped we could get through. And so I had to call and say that I was a Swarthmore College student doing research on opportunities for women in the FBI, and I wondered if I could have an interview with the head of the office. And they very graciously gave me an appointment, and I showed up trying to look not at all like my usual identity. I disguised my appearance as much as I possibly could, but they were very gracious and gave me a half an hour or so, and that gave me the opportunity to get the layout of the office, to see that there were no alarms, to see that the file cabinets were not even locked, and to check out a second door that we might need to use to get through on the night of the burglary.
And Bonnie, you told Will Bunch at the Philadelphia Inquirer in a recent interview that 50 years ago we were criminals and now we're heroes. Could you talk about how your decision to get involved in this? At the time you were 29 years old, a mother of 3.
Well, my husband and I had been involved in the draft resistance movement, the so-called Catholic left, previously, going into draft boards in the middle of the night and removing draft files to destroy the files and try to disrupt the draft system. So we like to say that we got our burglary skills from nuns and priests. But when all of the protests against the war in Vietnam were not making any difference, and we realized that the government was lying to citizens about the war, we thought that we needed to take a different kind of step in civil disobedience and get proof to show what FBI agents were doing in the Philadelphia area, things that were unconstitutional, immoral, and illegal. And the only way to do that was to get our hands on documents. So that it seemed like a rational thing to do to get the truth out to the American public.
And I'd like to bring Paul Coates into the conversation and ask you, Paul, what, from your perspective, your involvement in the Black Panther Party at the time, what the group looked like, and what the impact of this break-in, these revelations about COINTELPRO had on you and your organization?
You know, the large impact, I think, at the time was we already knew that we were being infiltrated. We knew that provocateurs were all throughout. We knew that the FBI had us under constant surveillance. But I don't think anyone at the time really knew the full extent of the program, of COINTELPRO. We saw the surveillance, we saw the interference and the setups that were being done as acts that the government, as a broad government, was doing. But the break-in actually, I like to think of it as put flesh to the bones of what became known as COINTELPRO. And they did it in a way that, like I guess, like they intended to do. They did it with the FBI's own documents. They named people, they named places, and that documentation not only served us then, but the documentation serves us. It continues to serve us today, and I think that's the major impact. It made visible what we knew was there but could not really see.
I mean, in fact, this was the first time, wasn't it, that COINTELPRO was being made known, Bonnie, these documents that you were putting out everywhere. And then, Paul, this whole story of not only the FBI's war on the Black Power movement, but specifically, and this directly related to you, Black-owned bookstores, why they saw Black-owned bookstores like yours as such a target.
Yeah, this is true. And I think a lot of that comes out of certainly the FBI history and in following socialist groups and knowing that the bookstores were critical information centers, as they were in our community. And the store we established certainly was, because that was its intent. It was intended to be an information center, particularly for people, not just Panthers, but people who were incarcerated in jail, coming out of jail and becoming contributing members of the community. We felt we could do that with information. And certainly we came under a lot of pressure from the FBI, a lot of pressure from the state and the city at the time, who saw this, perceived this as a threat. The very thought that information, the very thought that knowledge could equip people to be better in their community and contributors in their community was a threat to them.
So, Juan, at the beginning of this story, we talked about the people who are targeted, Black Panthers, anti-war movement, peace activists, and the Young Lords. You're one of the co-founders of the Young Lords. Can you talk about what you understood at the time?
Well, I think what Paul is saying about we understood that there were agents within our organizations, but we never understood how systematic and how widespread it was. And I recall particularly, this is about a year before the break-in of the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. I was traveling with another Young Lord member, we thought secretly, to Puerto Rico to look at the possibility of opening up new branches. And we're on the plane heading to San Juan. We suddenly see a young African-American attorney who we knew from legal aid in East Harlem. And he came over, sat by us, started joking. And we said to him, so, Bobby, what do you do? You're in legal aid. Why are you going down to Puerto Rico? And he said, well, I don't work for legal aid anymore. I work for the U.S. Justice Department. And I've been assigned to the two of you. And I want you to know, he looked at us directly in the eyes, and he said, I want you to know that every second that you are in Puerto Rico, you are going to be tailed by the agents of the SEEK. That's the Puerto Rico equivalent of the Red Squad in Puerto Rico. And wherever you go in Puerto Rico, we're going to be there. And sure enough, they were always not only following us, but interviewing anybody who we talked to or we met with, because they saw the need to appear to be everywhere. And I want to ask Paul, because people don't realize the psychological impact it had on these organizations to know that there were agents within them, but not know who they were. And often people were targeted who were innocent people, but were mistaken for agents. And the real agents were still providing information on a regular basis and creating dissension within the groups.
Yeah, Juan, you're so right. You're so on. It was like a double whammy, because on the one hand, you'd have agents who would make themselves known. And then you knew there were plenty of other agents who were unknown, but you would, let's say if you're doing something today, information on that would be broadcast in multiple ways the next day. And so you know someone from the inside did it. And Juan, you probably have this experience as well. This is certainly COINTELPRO had its impact when the events were taking place. But now we're talking about 50 years later, 5 decades later, Juan, and we're still trying to figure out who were agents at the time. You have to, it's that going on, but also the rumors that were started, the identification of people who weren't, like you're saying, who weren't agents, but they were labeled as agents. And even today, among comrades in the Panther Party, you'll have a conversation with someone, a name will come up, and you say, well, you know he was a snitch, don't you? Or he was an agent, don't you? And that may not be the case at all. We're still living through and picking through the rumors that literally split our movement at the time. We're still living through those rumors now, and they still split us.
So I wanted to also bring in Bonnie Raines to talk about the latest member of the Media Eight, the burglars, including you, who has just come forward in a piece in the San Francisco Chronicle. 50 years after an FBI office burglary, a San Rafael man reveals his role. And it says, before the Pentagon Papers, before WikiLeaks, before Edward Snowden's NSA files, a group of 8 Vietnam War protesters teamed up to steal FBI records from a Pennsylvania office. And it goes on to say, Ralph Daniels squeezed himself through the door, looked around the dark room. They'd cased this small FBI office in Philadelphia suburb of Media for months. Now he was inside. Rows of file cabinets beckoned. This was the moment the group of 8 had planned. They'd long suspected FBI malfeasance, were convinced these records would prove it. Daniel was 26 at the time, rolled out the first metal cabinet drawer, scooped up the files, threw them into a suitcase. His gloved hand shook. The burglars had to hurry. They'd chosen March 8th, 1971, because Muhammad Ali's title fight against Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden would keep most of the country and world, and most importantly, FBI agents and police, glued to closed-circuit screens and radios for a few hours. One of the intruders could hear the broadcast in nearby apartments, so they thought that the sound of the fight would cover your actions. Is that right, Bonnie? And were you surprised to see that Ralph Daniel has come forward?
Well, I'm delighted that Ralph has. He played a key role in the burglary, and he was reluctant to come forward earlier because he was afraid that it would affect his professional life. But he's always been in communication with us since 2014, and it's great to have him be able to tell his story now, which is significant. We scooped up every single document, I think about 1,000 documents. We didn't leave anything behind. And going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago in the broadcast, one of the memos that we discovered, a document said that agents should increase the paranoia among the left to have them believe that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. So they wanted to give this impression that everyone everywhere was under surveillance, and no one could believe that their constitutional rights would be protected.
And Bonnie, we only have about 30 seconds, but could you the lessons for today for the Black Lives Matter movement and other activists of this COINTELPRO era? Well, we've just come through a Trump era, and I think we saw the effects of a lack of transparency and accountability. And now we really have to insist that the powers that be are transparent and accountable. And it's up to the average citizen to pay attention, be informed, and be vigilant, and then call the powers that be to account for their decision. We're going to have to leave it there, and I thank you so much for being with us. Bonnie Raines, one of the 1971 break-in burglars at the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and Paul Coates, founder and director of Black Classic Press. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.